So turning fractions into percents is easy when the denominator is something that is friendly with a per 100. So if the denominator is 10 or 25 or 50 or 5, any of those are really good because I can make the denominator up to 100, and then it's simple because a percent is out of 100. So what do you do, though, when you run into a situation like these where the denominators are not so friendly with 100? You got to have another plan. So what I like to tell people to do is that if something wants to become a percent, if it's not a percent and it wants to be a percent, if you multiply it by 100%, it'll get you there. It works every single time. It might not be as clean as something that's more easy to convert to a 100, but it'll work. So, for instance, if I take 3/7, and I multiply it by 100%, it'll work. It'll get me there. Now, it's not super clean. It gives me 300 over 7%. And then I might need to use a calculator or do some long division to find out how many sevens go into 300. If you have a calculator, it's much easier. If you don't, you have to actually do the math here. What it looks like I get is 42, and there's 6 leftovers out of 7. That's my answer. 42 and 6/7 percent. All I had to do was to make it into a percent, multiply it by 100%. So this thing here is not a percent. It wants to be a percent. So I need to take 1 2/3 and multiply it by 100%. So I'm going to have to deal with fractions here. I'm going to make this 1 2/3 into an improper fraction, 5/3. I'm going to multiply it by 100% over 1. It gives me 500% over 3, which isn't that pretty, but I can use long division, or if you have a calculator, even better. It looks like we get 166 2/3%. And so it sort of makes sense because this is over a whole anyway over here. This is over 100%. Why don't you try the bottom two? Try the bottom two, pause it, and then I'll go over how to do them. Okay, so 1/6. 1/6, if I multiply it by 100% over 1, it gives me 100% over 6. And then I just have to figure out how many times it goes in. (16 4/6), or I can call that 16 2/3 of a percent. There's my answer. The next one, I'm going to have to take 2 4/7 and multiply it by 100%. I'm going to need some fractions here, though. So I'm going to make this 2 4/7 into 18/7 times 100 over 1%. And it gives me 1800 over 7%. And now I'm just going to have to do some math here. If you have a calculator, that'll definitely help. I've got 257 1/7%. That's tough. It's a hard one, but it can be done. If something wants to be a percent, just multiply it by 100%. Now here, what if I have a percent that doesn't want to be a percent anymore? Well, if I wanted to make something a percent, I multiply it by 100%. So if something is a percent and it doesn't want to be one anymore, it wants to become a fraction, I'm going to divide it by 100%, which is the opposite, which sort of makes sense. So for instance, 14 2/7%. Okay, so if I take 14 2/7% and I just divide it by 100%, I should get my answer. So I'm going to need to clean this up here a little bit. This becomes 100 over 7 divided by 100%. Well, I know when I divide, I do the reciprocal. So I get, oh, I see a shortcut here. Well, there's 1/7. My answer is 1/7. All I had to do was divide it by 100%. It doesn't want to be a percent, so divide it by 100%. Here I've got 37.5. 37 and 1/2. If I divide it by 100%, I'll get rid of the percent. So let me try this. Becomes 75 over 2 times the reciprocal. If I'm going to divide by 100%, it's the same as 1 over 100. If I get that, I get 75 over 200. I can simplify that. I can divide them both by 25. I get 3 over 8. There's my answer, 3/8. Remember, if something does not want to be a percent anymore, divide it by 100%. Why don't you try these bottom two? Okay, let's look at these bottom two. I've got 5 1/4%. Well, 5 1/4%, if I divide it by 100%, it'll give me my answer. So I'm just going to use some improper fraction here. This becomes 21. Oops. This becomes 21/4 times the reciprocal, which is 1 over 400. That gives me 21 over 400. And I don't think they have anything in common. I think I'm done. 21/400. It's not a percent anymore. That's why I divided it by 100%. Here, this next one, I've got 7 3/8%, but it doesn't want to be a percent anymore. So I'm going to take 7 3/8%, and I'm going to divide it by 100%. So I better get some fractions going here. 59 over 8 times the reciprocal. It's 1 over 100. I multiply, I get 59 8/100ths. And 59 is prime, so I think we're about done here. 59 8/100ths. Looks like it'll work. You can do the same exact thing with stuff that doesn't want to be decimals that don't want to be fractions anymore. So what I would do is I would take 41.8 and I just divide it by 1 over 100, or multiply it, excuse me, by 1 over 100. 41.8 over 100. I can make that 418 over 1,000. Then I can start to reduce from there. Again, if you have a calculator, it's going to be so much easier. That becomes 209 over 500, and I think that's all it is. For this one, 25.5%, if I take 25.5 and divide it by 100, that's the same as 25.5 times 1 over 100. That gives me 25.5 over 100. I can multiply the top and bottom by 100 to get rid of, or by 10, excuse me, to get rid of that decimal. I can divide them by 5. And I think we're about done. Try this one. See if you can turn that percent into not a percent anymore. Just a fraction in simplest form. 6.02 divided by 100% is the same as 6.02 times 1 over 100. I've got 6.02 over 100, which is 602 over 1,000. They're both even. I'll make it 301 over 500, and I think I'm done. So that's how you do these versions. If you're stuck, if you have something that works really well with 10 or 100, it makes it easy. But if you don't, if you have denominators or fractions or things like that that don't work out well, you can always multiply something by 100% to make it a percent, or divide it by 100% to not make it a percent anymore.